Here's today's First Word Daily Devotion.
It's June the 28th, and yesterday we sort of left on a cliffhanger where we were looking at Hezekiah and the king of Assyria, as the king of Assyria was calling into question Israel's hope and trust in the Lord. In other words, the question is, what is God going to do? Will he save or will he won't? And so let's see what happens. 2 Kings 19 through 20. As soon as King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. He sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and the senior priest covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. Now here comes Isaiah. Look at what happens in verse 5. When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Say to your master, Thus saith the Lord, don't be afraid, because of the words that you've heard, with which your servant the king of Assyria have reviled me, which the servants, rather, of King Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." And so let's see what happens. Look at verse 10. "Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you." And here again is Rabshakeh again speaking on behalf of the Assyrians, saying, "Don't let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will be given to you out of the hand of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands, devoting them to destruction. And do you think you shall be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them?" And then he goes through the list. "The nations that my father destroyed, Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who are in Telassar. Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sheravaim, the king of Hena, or the king of Ivah?" Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord, spread it before the Lord, and Hezekiah prayed before the Lord, and he said, now pay close attention to how Hezekiah reacted. Remember, Hezekiah is a bright spot in a dark lineage of kings. And he, of course, takes this matter before the Lord in prayer. Oh, that we would do the same, that we would cast our cares upon the Lord, remembering that he cares for us. He is more ready to answer our prayers than we are willing to ask them. And that should encourage us to not to pray because he knows already, but to pray all the more. Then Isaiah, son of Amos, sent to Hezekiah, saying, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, your prayers to me about Sennacherib, king of Israel, I have heard. This is the word that the Lord has spoken." In other words, and notice this fact as well, God answers by his prophets. He answers Isaiah or Hezekiah by his prophets. And then look at his answer, verse 25. "Have you not heard that I determined it long ago?" In other words, I'm in control. I planned from days of old, and now I'm going to bring it to pass that you should turn fortified cities into heaps of ruin. In other words, I know all of these things, so don't be alarmed. And then look at this reference here. This is reference to a third, but this is a third year. At verse 29, there's a reference to the third day here in this verse here. In verse 6, or excuse me, in verse 5, there's another reference to the third day. But let's see how Hezekiah is answered. "Therefore, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into the city, or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with shield, or cast up a siege mound against it. By the way he came, by the same he shall return. He shall not come into his city, declares the Lord, for I will defend this city to save it." And look at the language, "for my own sake, and for the sake of my servant David." Not for you, but because of me and the promise. "And that night," here's verse 35. Remember, what is God going to do? Is he going to save or not? Well, verse 35 answers, "And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, there were all these dead bodies. Then Sennacherib king of Assyria departed and went home and lived in Nineveh, and as he was worshiping in the house of Nishroth his god, Adramelech, and Sharez his son struck him down with a sword and escaped the land of Arat, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his place." And thus we have the story. God's word through his prophet indeed comes to pass. And then look at what happens right away in Acts, right after we have, not in Acts, in 2 Kings, right after we have Hezekiah praying, we have another instance that lets us understand prayer. In chapter 20, Hezekiah, after this great victory, he becomes sick, and he brings his petition before the Lord. And the Lord answers him, verse 6, for David's sake, for David's sake. Now look at Acts chapter 28. There's so much details that it's just one of my favorite stories. I hope that you are reading it and enjoying it. But let's turn over, because of time, into Acts chapter 28, where of course we remember this very influential story of Paul and the viper. After the ship is run aground, on his way to Rome, he encounters a viper, and of course he shakes it off into the fire. In verse 11, 3 months, we see that. And in verse 12, there's another reference to 3 days. And then look at verse 15. And the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius, and 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And we close today's reading at Psalm 147. Well, we'll actually close at Proverbs, but let's read Psalm 147. Remember this, after we encountered what we encountered in this wonderful story of Hezekiah and this God defeating 185,000 Assyrians, here we have this psalm to greet us, to remind us that He determines the number of the stars, and He gives to all of them their names. He delights not in the strength of the horses, His pleasure is not in the legs of man, but the Lord takes the pleasure in those who fear Him, and those who hope in His steadfast love. Look at verse 18. He sends out His word and melts them. He makes His wind blow, and the waters flow. And this is why we end today at Proverbs 18, verse 10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous man runs into it and is safe. And that's why we read the Bible every day, to remember that these stories are more real because they're God's revelation. They're history according to Him. It's more real than anything that we will encounter. And so we run into the refuge of the Lord, and we are safe because He is mighty to save.